Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Hello and welcome to this special online episode of Idaho Reports with Governor Brad Little. We recorded this conversation with the governor Tuesday morning, shortly before the U.S. Justice Department announced it is suing the state of Idaho over its abortion laws, accusing the state of denying life-saving health care to pregnant women and violating the Federal Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. Though Idaho's law criminalizing abortion does include a provision for the life of the mother, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland said on Tuesday it doesn't allow for abortions to prevent serious jeopardy or harm to the woman's health. Idaho's laws criminalizing abortion aren't currently in effect, and the Idaho Supreme Court will hear arguments on August 3rd on whether it should stay those laws, as well as combine oral arguments for them during a potential future hearing or remand them to lower courts. As the news from the U.S. Justice Department came out after our interview, we don't discuss that specifically in our conversation about Idaho's abortion laws. We'll continue to follow this story at Idaho Reports as it unfolds. In the meantime, here's the full interview. Thank you so much for joining us today. $1.4 billion surplus that we closed out fiscal year 22 in. What are your priorities for the upcoming legislative session?
They're the same. Well, obviously, we'll see what happens in the election this fall, but we're preparing to do the same thing we did before. Give a healthy percent of it back, continued investments in education, continued investments in infrastructure. Obviously, we've done some incredible things in behavioral health, and we'll continue to work on that. But as we see where we put money into education, we want to make sure that we're successful. We've got a new dashboard that's coming out on our reading initiative, which is really my highest priority, is to get kids reading proficiently at the end of the third grade. And as that data comes out, and it's available to teachers, problem is teachers aren't around right now, but that will give us an indicator of where we need to target those dollars.
You have critics on both sides, one saying that, this is a budgeting problem. If you have this much money left over in a state with a budget like Idaho's, that means that you're neglecting some of the duties that the state has. Yet the other side says that if you have this much left over, you've been taxing way too much. I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, nobody, and as I alluded, I just talked to the budget officers from all over the state. Nobody knows what normal is. When the federal government puts $5 or $6 trillion, maybe $7 trillion into the economy, we know that that's not normal. We know that income taxes, sales taxes are going to go up and down from there. So everybody's trying to figure out what the new normal is. That's why we've chosen to pay off any debt that's available that we can pay off, to fund needed infrastructure, make big investments in education, give part of the money back until we know what the new normal is. And all the states are struggling with what's the new normal. The nice thing about it is if things tip over, there's rumors about a recession, you're going to be in as good a shape in Idaho as any state because of what we've done, because we're prepared. You could spend it all, but then you build your base up, and if the economy doesn't have to go down, if it just slows, you're going to be in a problem, because we've had a 20 to 30% increase in revenue every year, and I don't think anybody thinks that's normal.
As we're having this conversation, there have been a lot of Idahoans who have been hurting at the gas pump, with gas hovering around $5 per gallon in Idaho. Other states have called special sessions to send out immediate relief to their citizens. Why didn't you call a special session and send out tax relief in response to those gas prices?
We did. Whatever you paid in taxes last year, you got 12% of it back. Matter of fact, that 12% came right as the fuel I was ahead of the game. We'd already made the determination, myself and the legislature, to give that 12% back. And in Idaho, most everybody pays income taxes.
So that was an income tax rebate, but that was in motion before the gas prices went up this summer.
Well, but it would have been a windfall had it not been for inflation. But instead of a windfall, it was exactly what people needed to compensate for. If the CPI has gone up 10%, I give everybody back 12%. It's, and it depends upon where you are on the continuum, how much of your disposable income you spend, particularly on fuel, and so. That's what we've done, and then the other time, and at the same time, we lowered the rates. So you had less taken out of your check
lowered the
for
tax
taxes,
rates for income,
and then we gave you a rebate in between, because that's state money. If we do anything on the fuel tax side, that means that some of the things we're planning to do as far as bridges and roads and other things is going to be somewhat disrupted. So I'm comfortable, but if it continues, we'll get ready to do another big tax rebate.
Even with that $1.4 billion, you're worried about that disrupting the projects that are already in motion?
No. We'll give a big chunk of that back.
I wanted to ask you about the GOP state convention in July. One of the biggest news items to come out of that convention was a resolution to limit Republican primary participation to those who had been registered Republicans for at least 25 months and those who hadn't donated or supported candidates from other parties, among other restrictions. Do you agree?
The summer meeting is where, these things are floated. And then it's not totally dissimilar from the legislative process. Well, then you ruminate on them until January when they're implemented. And if you'll remember, a year ago in January, they had, and I think it was the last time I was on, no, it was the preview. I got asked a question about allowing precinct committee people to select all the candidates.
That was in January 2022,
yeah.
Right.
And I said, that was an idea that kind of rose to the top, but when people started looking at the unintended consequences of it, and there'll be unintended consequences. The Republican Party has more people in Idaho than unaffiliated, but that is just a very, very recent. Unaffiliated has been our largest block of voters in the state of Idaho, and I know those people, and they're Republicans, but they choose to be unaffiliated.
So conservative, unaffiliated voters. So if I'm reading between the lines of what you just said, it sounds like you're not thrilled with this plan.
We got time to figure out what the unintended consequences of it. I just, I know a lot of people, and it depends on what county you're in. If you're in Blaine County or Teton County or in some of those counties, and you want to, you're a Republican, but you want to select the candidates for prosecutor, county commissioner, whatever it is, you're going to stay. Of course, the Democrats can go back and forth, but that's the way it is with the Republican. People want to be able to participate to select some of those local officials, and if you don't participate in the primary, you flat don't participate.
What would you say, though, to criticisms of the current process that allow people to come in and essentially pick a party's candidates for the general election for them?
I've seen that happen, but it doesn't last. I know people that weren't my kind of a Republican that ran and got elected, and usually in a light turnout election, but our system works, and eventually they lost. It causes a temporary issue, but your voting record is what you're going to stand on. So I've seen it happen. It's no different than the Democratic Party. I would just with Governor Hogan of Maryland, the National Democratic Party selecting the least capable Republican candidate to win in Maryland, so that the preferred candidate by the Republican Party there didn't win. People participating in other primaries you might get something in the short term, but long term, your record's still going to determine. And, I know people, matter of fact, I think the candidate that brought this proposal served in the House and the Senate as a Democrat.
That is true. You said people who aren't your kind of Republican. What do you mean by that?
Well, the fundamentals, long-term fundamentals of the Republican Party, limited government, maximum freedom, the lighter hand of government, those fundamentals, basic Idaho family values that are not out there on either side. I've been involved in the Republican Party since 1964 when Goldwater ran. I've got a pretty good idea what Republican politics are in Idaho.
There are a lot of people in your own party, though, who would disagree, who have called you Rhino for many years now, I'll say. And after this last convention, is that the direction that the party is shifting? Is that telling you that this is what Idaho Republicans want?
The Republican Party, and I've watched this for years, has gotten large enough that nature abhors a vacuum, and if you don't have competition, then there's going to be competition there. I understand that. I get it. I've seen it happen before. I remember what it was like in 1990 when we had a tied Senate, and it was a whole different deal than it is today.
I wanted to ask you, of course, about Idaho's abortion laws, the trigger laws and the ones that are going to be in front of the Idaho Supreme Court. Specifically the one where prosecutors can prosecute a doctor who has performed an abortion. Is this a workable law? How will prosecutors know if a pregnancy is valid under Idaho's law?
Well, in my transmission letter, when I sent it back, I said there's some issue. I've always been pro-life, and I'm still pro-life. But we've got two different lawsuits that are going to be in front of the Supreme Court this month. We've also got things happen at the national level. So there's a lot of things in flux, and we'll have to see. I am concerned about that very question you asked about in a state with the least amount of doctors and particularly pediatric doctors in rural areas. We've got to make certain that the unintended consequences, because I'm pro-life, and that includes the life of the mother, and I'm very concerned about it if we have an exodus of good trained pediatric physicians.
So why'd you sign the law?
Well, I signed it because I was pro-life, and I said we're going to have to work some of these things out. We had an idea that Roe was going to be, the Dobbs decision was going to trump over the top of Roe, but we didn't know what all the details are, and we still don't know, and we've got these two lawsuits.
If the new legislature that's coming in 23, if they pass a ban on IUDs, would you sign it?
We'll have to see. I mean, I obviously. Birth control is a totally different area than a fetal heartbeat situation.
If there are more births in Idaho as a result of this law, and if the court says that it can go into place, is the state prepared to support these families?
We should have been doing it anyway. But now this is gonna predicate us doing more. You're familiar with all the good work we did in foster care, because we had some real problems in foster care. Adoptions, mother support, foster care, every one of those areas, which is the right thing to do, we will implement in Idaho. We will, I'll have to sit down with the legislature, have to sit down with the Board of Health and Welfare about what we can do to be as supportive as possible of mothers in situations that are difficult for them.
We've been playing catch up with foster care through no fault of the social workers who have been working so hard. Is this going to be too little too late?
No, I don't believe so. But I mean, it's going to highlight the issue. It's going to make it more important, and that's a good thing, and it dovetails a little bit with what we're doing in the behavioral health area about what kind of support services we provide to everyone, but particularly these mothers that are having challenging situations.
There's lots of speculation nationwide that Obergefell is next, and both the Idaho Constitution and the Republican Party platform define marriage as between one man and one woman. Do you support overturning same-sex marriage in Idaho?
Of course, that's going to be decided at the federal level. If I was to make a prediction, I'd say I think it's going to stay the same way it is right now. So I think it's, and again, we just want to encourage healthy families. That's the most important thing, is have an atmosphere where these kids grow up loved by their family and have the best possible route to success in their lives.
Recently, Idaho's 2 congressmen split their votes on the Respect for Marriage Act, which would codify protections for same-sex marriage. Do you agree with Congressman Simpson's vote to support same-sex marriage?
I knowing full well that wasn't going to make it across the rotunda, sometimes those are symbolic votes. They're important for them, but I'm more interested in subject, in things that actually happen rather than a symbolic vote that doesn't have a chance of a snowball in hell of getting across the president's desk.
Hypothetically, though,
Yeah.
if you were Congressman Simpson, would you have voted for that symbolic bill?
I frankly, because it had so little chance of becoming law, I didn't even spend any time on it.
I wanted to ask you about state employee retention as well. The state of employee has about 350 job openings right now, and a lot of them are in the $14, $15 range,
Right.
Lots in the $20 range, construction and legal jobs where people could make a lot more money in the private sector. What's your plan to catch up and retain those employees?
It's interesting. This was when I was doing my budget as lieutenant governor in front of when I used to go up in front of JFAC, and I says, this is a good problem that wages are rising, and every state agency has a problem, and we're trying to be as creative as we can to help some of these agencies. We're kind of reworking how we to make, particularly for those most competitive jobs. I think one of the biggest things we're going to have to do this year is in the nursing area, because nurses were so negatively impacted by COVID and then by the traveling nurse. So if I complain about state pay, I got 1,000 businesses behind me going, what about us? We're increasing teacher pay significantly, 12% this year, and really enhancing the benefits. That's what you have to do. But I mean, we have the responsibility as state government, both the executive and the legislative branch, to do the same thing that businesses. How can we be more efficient? What can we do? Can we hire some part-time people to reduce full-time positions? All of that's going to be on the table, but you're not going to get much sympathy from small and large businesses and say we're having a hard time doing retention.
You mentioned teachers, of course, which is critically important for our public schools. There were 900 vacant positions among teachers earlier this summer. You said there's a lot on the table. Should districts have more flexibility to hire people to teach who aren't traditionally certified?
We should, but we got to. I wouldn't necessarily want to open that floodgate all the way up, because we still have to, as in any field, we still have to have some level of professionalism, but you can't allow a classroom to not have a science teacher, a math teacher, and of course, one of the areas we have the biggest problems is special education. STEM, special education are two of the areas where we have the biggest problems in school districts. When I talk to principals and superintendents, I always, this time of year, how you doing? And some of them say we're all filled up, but more and more they're having problems. But it's just exactly the same problem as what you asked me about state. We are victims of our own success because of our incredible growth that's taken place here in Idaho.
Lots of families moving here with lots of kids.
Yeah.
I know that much. Along those lines, more and more parents are supporting public education dollars being used for private education. Dollars following the students is often what they say. What's your ideal setup?
Well, I have I think maybe the first charter bill was right before I got in the legislature, but I've been a huge advocate for choice. But I've always said that I'm an advocate for choice to the point to where it's not significantly diminutive, detrimental to our public education funding, because Boise's a heck of a lot different than Midvale or fill in the blank from some rural area. And so we have to have a system we got a constitutional mandate to have a system of schools. If we dilute or significantly reduce the fundings available, you're going to have big problems, particularly in rural Idaho, and that's kind of the lens that I look at all these issues.
Speaking of school funding, will you support the Quality Education Act?
I know there's a debate now over what the fiscal note was on the Quality Education Act, particularly relative to the tax bill we had last year. I would just add that you look at the amount of money that we put into education, you look at the amount simultaneously with all the tax issues we've had. Idaho education and the taxpayers have got a good deal under what we've done the last 2 years. And I don't know why they need to make their decision on that vote predicated on the trajectory that we've been on and the trajectory that we'll continue on if I'm successful in November.
If you're successful in November, is that trajectory going to include fixing problems like we've read about recently with, the Middleton School District, for example, having to hold classes in public spaces like libraries or teacher lounges? Is this good deal that you speak of for Idahoans enough to fix those very real problems related to growth?
Well, we do bond levy equalization, and we help out in quite a few areas in schools, but Middleton's a good example, and I used to represent Middleton. If you're going to have wholesale growth and not maintain your facilities, you're going to have an issue. Is that a state problem or is that a local problem? That's a debate we ought to have. It's a legitimate debate. Does every school district get the exact same number of gymnasiums that Blaine County has? We have got about 12 different laws we passed in response to how sufficient were we in meeting our constitutional challenge. We need to continue to look at them, but we can't fix everything at the state level. That's why you elect your local trustees and you participate in, and hypothetically, if you've got enough growth, you've got new tax revenue coming in that should pick up part of the growth going through there. People will object to a school bond once in a while, but if they plan it correctly and they got one bond going off and another one going on, they basically make the case, we can have a new school and your taxes won't go up.
Switching gears here, there was a Boise Deb investigation this summer that found that ITD knew about potential problems with construction on Highway 55. It's now significantly over budget, behind schedule. Had some pretty dangerous landslides at one point. You asked for answers from ITD after that investigation came out. Did you get those answers, and are you satisfied with them?
We did, but what we weren't satisfied with was the magnitude of the problem and that we didn't know about it. And the fact that, legitimate questions were being asked and they weren't being answered in what we expect. And I believe we've got that problem. I'm never excited when a project goes double over their budget. Now, the Department of Transportation is run by an independent board. I was with two of them yesterday at a groundbreaking for a big project in Pocatello, and they're the ones that are ultimately responsible. But for us, we've got an expectation about when there's a legitimate request, that request is not answered. And I think they would agree that there was the old classic failure to communicate, and but I got a lot of feedback about how safe it was. I drove through there Sunday morning early, and that cut 8, which is the controversial part of it, that goes clear to the top of the hill. And the other thing is, which we didn't have before, I grew up driving that road I've been driving that road for 50 some years, and rolling rocks have always been a problem there. The new construction, they're going to put nets in there to where that's not going to be a problem. Because I know when the weather changes in the spring, particularly when you have freeze and thaw, Highway 55 is something that every driver needs to be very careful with.
Are you satisfied with changes that ITD may be making after having those conversations?
Oh yes, it looked like it was, it's not a big deal, but it was a big deal, particularly when they dove into it. And I think we've got the correction, but I think needless to say, I wasn't very excited about it when I first heard about it, that A, we didn't know about it, and B, there was an issue. But, I did a lot of work, the legislature did a lot of work to get ITD more funding. If things are going to cost double what they are, what's going to fall off the end of the, and that's a unique piece of real estate. There's no question about it. But we have to be better at bidding these projects. I used to ask every state agency, are we on time and are we under budget? I joked the other day that if you're under budget, you probably bid it too much, given, particularly in the construction area, the hyperinflation we have there, which is a real problem.
So here's a really wonky question for you. Does that mean that the bidding process on the state level needs to change so we get an accurate view of what these projects are going to cost with our actual needs as a state?
You could do that, but you could say we got to do in this particular instance, we got to do every kind of core drilling, we got to do every kind of everything before it, but then the board has to make the determination, is that money that we spend preparing the bid going to be counter to efficiently doing the job? It's something you always need to review. And in fact, in a new inflationary, if this is going to be the new normal, the cost of steel, concrete, construction equipment is going to be the new normal, we do need to relook at, just like business would, bidding these projects with a finer point than we did before. But I expect all the agencies to be adaptive to a changing economy.
Speaking of that road up to McCall, there are a lot of upset people in Valley County right now after the land board voted to auction off Cougar Island. You're constitutionally bound to make decisions that get the greatest financial benefit, of course, but that doesn't take into account other uses of the land or the effects on the community. Do you support a constitutional change on this?
Well, you kind of got two questions in there. One of them is that was in the queue for over 2 years. And I don't know what the community up there was thinking about. And in fact, there's one house on it now. Under the probably the wildest scenario, there might be 2 on it. The endowment is going to get who knows how many $1 million. It's really not going to change much from what it is. The bigger question is the state over 80 years has aggregated real estate in McCall because they knew it was going to be worth more. So there are communities in Idaho that had state land that now have all federal land because that all got exchanged to there. We actually, when we had the earlier discussion, we have not been precluded from saying maybe we can get enough revenue here with somebody to expand Ponderosa Park, to have more open space and still capitalize on it.
The Ponderosa Park is that state park for
right.
people who aren't familiar with the area.
Expand Ponderosa State Park. But the question is, are you going to allow affluent people in Ada, Blaine, Valley, Bonner, Teton County to say, we want our state land for a park and you guys everywhere else generate cash off of it? I don't think now the people in those counties would love that. that you convert that state land. And in fact, if we do that, it leads to your second question, you'd have to amend the Constitution.
Do you support amending the Constitution?
Well, there's a lot of different ways you can amend the Constitution. They did that in Colorado. I've been aware of that, and in fact, most states have different ways in which their lands that were given to them at statehood, how they're used. The devil's in the detail of what that constitutional amendment looks like, but we do have an obligation to maximize income off of that land.
Okay, one last question. Are we going to see you at the debates in October?
We shall see.
Okay. The regular season of Idaho Reports returns to Idaho Public Television on October 2nd. And be sure to watch for the Idaho debate schedule, which will be out in September. We hope to see you there, Governor. In the meantime, you can always find our political analysis and in-depth reporting from around the state online, as well as our weekly podcast at idahoptv.org/Idaho Reports. Thanks so much for watching.
Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho, by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.